If you look at this fire, you know that the recent drone attacks on two apps were just a small taste of what the Ukrainians are really capable of. More on this in the Situation Report. June 14, 2026. We are in the 5th year and on day 112 since the start of the full-scale invasion. Welcome to the Situation Report. In today's report, we will look at attacks on more oil facilities. We will also look at how drones are still able to hit targets deep inside Russia. And we will also take a look at the situation in Konstantinivka, which is one of the focal points at the front. New footage shows a Ukrainian attack on the industrial area of Nizhny Kamsk in Tatarstan. The targets were apparently parts of the local refinery and energy infrastructure. FP-1 drones were used, which we have seen surprisingly often lately. There was a time when we hardly saw them at all. The successor drones, the FP-2, appeared much more frequently back then, in videos recorded by people, just before they crashed into some refinery. But since Firepoint was able to increase both the range and the payload, we're seeing new versions of these drones here. Nizhny Kamsk is not just any target. The city is one of the most important petrochemical centers in Russia. There is a large refining, chemical, and processing complex there, which plays an important role in supplying fuel and raw materials for the entire country. The refinery is far from the front and was considered a relatively safe location for Russian industry for a long time. These are the types of targets Ukrainian long-range drones are now increasingly striking. Targets that, just a few years ago, people thought no drone in the world would ever be able to reach them. That's why people saw them as safe. While the long lines in Crimea could still be portrayed as a regional problem, there are now reports of restrictions in St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Kazan. There, drivers are only allowed to buy 20 liters of gasoline per refueling at some gas stations. This is remarkable because we're not talking about remote regions here, but about the most important cities in the country. If someone starts restricting fuel sales in Moscow or St. Petersburg, that's not done for fun, that's simply done out of necessity. These are the places where this should only happen as a last resort. A few weeks ago, people in Crimea were standing in line for kilometers at gas stations. Now we're hearing about rationing, QR codes, and missing fuel tankers, and also about the quantity limits for Russian metropolises that have now been added. Of course, Russia is not going to run out of fuel tomorrow, I want to make that very clear, but measures like these are being introduced precisely to prevent that from happening. The authorities are obviously trying to stretch available supplies and avoid panic buying. This is a very unpleasant development for the Russian leadership. Fuel is one of those resources that, of course, Russia doesn't want people talking about as being in short supply. After all, Russia had the reputation of being an endless gas station. If one of the world's largest oil nations begins rationing gasoline, that's clearly not a good sign, and I don't need to explain further. Maria Zakharova, the foreign ministry spokesperson, has already done that for me, because she is asking the so-called friendly states for help due to the fuel problems in Russia. Just imagine that for a moment. Russia has the 8th largest oil reserves in the world, pumps millions of barrels out of the ground every day, and has been claiming for years that sanctions are ineffective. They likely didn't anticipate kinetic sanctions, as they're now seeking support from other countries due to low fuel. Because Ukraine is able to keep the country's logistics and fuel production firmly under control with just a few cheap drones. Just this news alone, as I said, would have been considered satire by anyone 3 years ago. While in Crimea, as you can see, people are standing in line for hours. At gas stations, everything is being rationed and there are new restrictions every day. Moscow suddenly has to admit that the situation is not as relaxed as they've been trying to portray it for years. And that's a very, very important signal when an official body makes such a request. The Temgtem power plant in Rybinsk in the Yaroslavl region is on fire. And this is not just any fuel depot on the outskirts of a provincial town. The facility serves as a strategic reserve for storing and distributing fuel in times of crisis and emergency situations, exactly for such moments when normal supply routes are disrupted or fail. You don't have to be a genius to realize that this is not a development you would want in the current situation. The longer the problems with transport, storage, and distribution persist, the more important such reserve locations become. If these very facilities then fail or are damaged, It increases the pressure on the entire system, and then nothing follows, because these are already the reserve facilities. There is no reserve for the reserve here. After this, there is simply nothing left. But what follows now is the oil slick that is now spreading over the roofs of the residents. Let's look at Konstantinivka. Konstantinivka is increasingly shaping up to be the site of the next major urban battle in the Donbass. After Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar, and Toretsk, this is now the fourth major battle in this small part of the front since the war began. All these locations are close together. Here we see Konstantinivka, here Chasiv Yar, right here to the east of it, Bakhmut and Toretsk. That is located a bit further south of Konstantinivka, right here at this spot. That was the last major battle in the region. And now the focus is on this former hub here. Since November, the Russians have been trying to advance towards the city bit by bit, at first through the suburbs, small infiltrations and attacks on the outskirts. By now, several districts are contested and Ukraine is beginning to lose control within the city. In some areas, Ukrainian and Russian positions are only a few streets apart. Here we see once again a Russian tactic that we already saw in Pokrovsk. Because they are unable to completely cut off the Ukrainian supply routes, they are instead trying to fight their way directly to the routes. The goal is not necessarily a large encirclement, but rather to make the supply line so inaccessible that the defenders have to gradually withdraw. Currently, the biggest battles are concentrated on three hotspots in the north and northeast. Previously, near Lvivka, Ukrainian units of the 156th Mechanized Brigade, as well as special forces from Kort and Omega, are fighting against Russian forces of the 4th Motorized Rifle Brigade. All of this is happening here at the blue marker. There are also battles a bit further east from there. So that's actually the second focal point. This is the area of Belgian Park and Shoemaker Park, where fighting is ongoing. And it's happening on almost every city block, and a third focal point is a bit further east at this spot here. Because here, Russian and Ukrainian units are also facing each other in very close quarters, and there is extremely heavy fighting here. Everything else in this yellow zone are areas where fighting is also currently taking place. Here, Russian and Ukrainian soldiers are fighting each other in small skirmishes, mainly in urban and house-to-house combat. However, the biggest battles are taking place here at these three locations. A Ukrainian commander recently spoke of approximately 130 Russian soldiers inside the city. Other observers, of course, consider the number to be too low and now estimate several hundred to 1,000 soldiers. Personally, I would also consider 130 to be far too few. At the same time, there are no indications here of any encirclement of Ukrainian defenders, which also means that they do not have a static front line here, as we saw a few years ago. That's why I would currently describe the situation as follows. The Russians are probably achieving their greatest success in Constantinople in months and are putting significant pressure on the Ukrainian defense. At the same time, it is still not clear how a possible victory in the city could lead to a larger operational breakthrough. Or to put it another way, the Battle of Constantinople may be coming to an end, but there will not really be an operational gain. Thanks to all subscribers, channel members, and the Algae crew. Special thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Rennecke, Sila, Silat Dusseldorf, and Frederick Meyerhofer. Please subscribe, like, comment, and see you in the next situation report.